I'm Natalie, 34, and I still remember that day so vividly. After my embryo transfer, all I wanted was my husband Kyle waiting for me. Instead, I dragged my aching body up 5 flights of stairs to our apartment, hope still flickering for our future family. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, unprepared for the emptiness that would greet me. The silence inside wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of my life shattering. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit like and subscribe to follow my journey from complete heartbreak to finding strength I never knew I had. Kyle and I met during sophomore year at Boston University. I was studying architecture, spending late nights hunched over drafting tables, while he majored in finance. We first noticed each other in the campus coffee shop where I'd fuel my all-nighters. He had this habit of bringing textbooks that seemed unnecessarily huge, always claiming he needed to understand the bigger financial picture. I found it endearing. After 3 months of casual flirting over increasingly elaborate coffee orders, he finally asked me out. Our first date was at a tiny Italian restaurant where the owner kept bringing us free appetizers because we couldn't stop laughing. 7 years of dating followed, with its ups and downs, but mostly filled with dreams of our future. We got married in a small ceremony on Cape Cod, surrounded by 40 of our closest friends and family. I wore my grandmother's restored wedding dress, and Kyle teared up when he saw me walking down the aisle. That moment felt perfect, like we'd beaten the odds in a world where relationships so often fail. The first few years of marriage were everything I'd hoped for. We bought our apartment in a brownstone building in the Back Bay neighborhood, adopting a golden retriever named Rusty and settling into careers we both enjoyed. I joined a well-regarded architectural firm specializing in sustainable urban development, while Kyle worked his way up at an investment firm downtown. Our life seemed to be following the blueprint we'd carefully designed together. When we decided to start trying for a baby 3 years ago, we never imagined the journey ahead. At first, it was exciting, tracking ovulation, planning romantic evenings, imagining our future child. But month after month, the disappointment of negative pregnancy tests began to wear on us. After a year without success, we consulted a fertility specialist who discovered I had endometriosis that had gone undiagnosed for years. The news was difficult, but Kyle held my hand through those first appointments. "We'll figure this out together," he promised, "however long it takes." And so began our fertility treatments. First came medication and monitored cycles, then intrauterine inseminations that left me cramping and hopeful, only to face disappointment again and again. Each failure felt like grief for a child we hadn't yet met. When our doctor recommended IVF, Kyle was initially hesitant about the cost, but eventually agreed. I still remember his words, "Your happiness is worth every penny." The process was brutal. Daily hormone injections that left my stomach bruised, endless blood draws, and the emotional roller coaster that came with each development. The egg retrieval procedure left me in pain for days, but we celebrated when we got 12 viable embryos. It felt like we had 12 chances at our dream. Our first transfer failed. So did the second. And the third. With each failure, I noticed Kyle's support beginning to waver. The man who had once administered my injections without flinching now found reasons to work late when I had appointments. The loving texts throughout the day dwindled to perfunctory check-ins. When I cried after our third failed transfer, he patted my back absent-mindedly while checking sports scores on his phone. Still, I clung to hope. We had embryos left, and our doctor suggested a different protocol for our 4th attempt. Kyle had seemed distracted lately, coming home later, going out with the guys more often, being vague about his whereabouts. I chalked it up to the stress we were both under and focused on the transfer. This had to work. We'd invested so much, not just money, but years of our lives, countless tears, and the strain on our relationship. The morning of my 4th embryo transfer, Kyle was supposed to drive me to the clinic. I'd been on bed rest for 24 hours prior, following a special protocol our doctor believed would help implantation. When I woke up, Kyle's side of the bed was empty. A text on my phone read, "Early meeting. Can you Uber to the clinic? We'll pick you up after." Disappointed but understanding, I called a rideshare and headed to the appointment alone. Throughout the procedure, the uncomfortable speculum, the catheter insertion, the nervous waiting, I kept checking my phone. I'd texted Kyle updates, but the messages remained unread. The doctor told me to remain lying down for 30 minutes after the procedure. And during that time, I called Kyle 3 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. "Don't worry," the nurse said, noting my distress. "Husbands sometimes get caught up at work. You need to stay calm for those embryos." By the time I was cleared to leave, it had been 3 hours without a response from Kyle. I called him again from the clinic lobby, fighting back tears of frustration and worry. "Hi, you've reached Kyle. Leave a message." I texted, "Procedure done. Where are you? I need a ride home." No response. After waiting another 30 minutes in the clinic lobby, growing increasingly uncomfortable from the procedure and embarrassed as staff gave me sympathetic glances, I finally ordered another rideshare. The driver, sensing my mood, mercifully remained silent for the 20-minute drive. By the time we pulled up to our brownstone, I was fighting nausea, a combination of the medications, stress, and growing unease about Kyle's absence. "Do you need help with your bags, ma'am?" the driver asked as I winced, stepping out of the car. "No, thank you. I'll manage," I replied, though the thought of climbing 5 flights of stairs with my clinic bag and purse seemed almost impossible in my current state. As I began the slow ascent, I tried Kyle once more. Straight to voicemail again. Something was wrong. Very wrong. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited above. The stairwell in our building had always been a minor annoyance, narrow, with steps that creaked and walls that needed a fresh coat of paint. But that day, each step felt like scaling a mountain. The doctor had advised minimal movement after the transfer, ideally bed rest for the remainder of the day. Instead, I was hauling myself up 5 flights, stopping every few steps to catch my breath and ease the cramping in my abdomen. By the 3rd floor, I had to sit down on the steps, closing my eyes against a wave of dizziness. An elderly neighbor from the 4th floor passed by on her way down, eyeing me with concern. "Are you all right, dear? You look pale as a ghost." "Just tired," I managed, forcing a smile. "Almost home." When I finally reached our apartment door, I leaned against it for a moment, fishing through my purse for keys with trembling hands. My body felt fragile, like I was carrying precious cargo, which, in a way, I was. Those embryos represented our last chance, the final 2 from our original 12. The key turned in the lock, and I pushed the door open, ready to collapse on our couch and finally confront Kyle about his disappearance. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Rusty always came bounding to the door when he heard keys in the lock, his nails clicking excitedly on the hardwood floors. But there was no golden retriever greeting me, no joyful barking. "Kyle," I called out, dropping my bag by the door. "Rusty?" My voice echoed in a way it never had before. I stepped further into the apartment and froze. The living room was half empty. Our sectional sofa remained, but Kyle's beloved leather recliner was gone. The entertainment center stood with gaping holes where his gaming console, collection of sports memorabilia, and half our books had been. Even the artwork had been selectively removed. Pieces he'd chosen were missing, leaving behind only those I'd picked out, creating an eerie, imbalanced look to the walls. My legs carried me to the kitchen on autopilot. The expensive coffee machine Kyle had insisted on buying was gone. So was the set of German knives he'd received from his parents last Christmas. The refrigerator, when I yanked it open, was nearly empty. His craft beers, protein shakes, and favorite snacks all vanished. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, a cold sensation spreading through my chest. "This can't be happening." I moved to our bedroom next, already knowing what I would find, but needing to see it anyway. Kyle's closet stood open and barren. The dresser drawers on his side hung open, emptied of contents. His nightstand had been cleared except for a lamp and a book I'd bought him that he'd never started reading. The bathroom told the same story. His electric razor, cologne, hair products all gone. Even his towel was missing from the hook behind the door. Back in the kitchen, something caught my eye. on the counter. Placed deliberately in the center of the marble surface we'd selected together during a renovation last year was Kyle's wedding ring. Beside it lay his key to the apartment. My hands shook as I picked up the ring, the metal cold against my palm. 7 years of marriage, reduced to an abandoned circle of gold. I fumbled for my phone, calling Kyle again with unsteady fingers. Straight to voicemail. This time, I left a message, my voice breaking. Kyle, where are you? Where's all your stuff? Where's Rusty? Please call me back. Please. As I hung up, a text notification appeared on my screen. From Kyle. I'm sorry to do it this way, but I couldn't face you. I can't do this anymore. The treatments, the disappointments, the pressure. I've taken Rusty to my parents. My lawyer will contact you about the divorce. Please don't call me. My knees gave out. I slid down against the kitchen cabinets until I hit the floor, the cold tile pressing against my legs. A guttural sound escaped me, part scream, part sob, as the full reality crashed down. My husband had planned this, timed it perfectly with my procedure. Systematically removed his possessions while I was at the clinic, unable to stop him or even say goodbye. I curled into myself on the kitchen floor, one hand instinctively moving to my abdomen where our embryos might be trying to implant at that very moment. Embryos that, if they survived, would now be solely my responsibility. Children who would never know their father because he'd chosen to leave before they even had a chance to exist. The physical pain from the procedure mingled with the shattering ache in my chest until I couldn't distinguish between them anymore. I don't know how long I lay there, but the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window had shifted to long afternoon shadows by the time I managed to pull myself up, clutching the counter for support. I moved like a sleepwalker to the couch, collapsing into its cushions, staring unseeing at the half-empty room around me. The space that had once been our home now felt like a cruel museum of abandonment, each missing item a deliberate reminder of what had been taken. In the silence, broken only by my ragged breathing, I realized something that made the situation even more unbearable. Kyle had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. No one removes every trace of themselves from a shared home on a whim. This was calculated, coordinated, and executed with precision, while I'd been focusing on hormone injections, doctor appointments, and the dream of our future family. As night fell and the apartment darkened around me, I remained frozen on the couch, unable to turn on a light, unable to process what my life had become in the span of a single day. The physical discomfort from the procedure grew, but it was nothing compared to the hollowness that had opened inside me, a chasm so vast I wasn't sure anything would ever fill it again. That first night alone in our half-empty apartment remains a blur in my memory. I didn't sleep so much as fade in and out of consciousness on the couch, unable to face our bedroom. Each time I closed my eyes, they would snap open again, my mind convinced that this was just a nightmare, that Kyle would walk through the door with Rusty at any moment, apologizing for some misunderstanding. My phone became both torture device and lifeline. I called Kyle repeatedly throughout the night, each unanswered ring driving the reality deeper. By morning, I'd left 17 voicemails, ranging from confused pleas to angry demands to broken sobbing. When the sun rose, casting unfamiliar shadows across the altered landscape of our living room, I finally called the one number I'd been avoiding, Kyle's parents. Susan and Richard had always been kind to me, if somewhat reserved. They lived about an hour outside the city, in the suburban neighborhood where Kyle had grown up. Susan answered on the third ring. Hello. Susan, it's Natalie. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, raspy from crying and lack of sleep. Is Kyle there? Is Rusty with you? The pause that followed told me everything before she even spoke. Oh, Natalie, yes, he's staying with us for a while. And yes, Rusty is here too. Did you know? The question came out as a whisper. Did you know he was planning to leave me? Another pause, longer this time. He's been unhappy for some time, dear. He talked to us about his feelings a few weeks ago. The betrayal cut even deeper. While I'd been giving myself injections and praying for our future family, my in-laws had been helping their son plan his escape from our marriage. He left while I was at the fertility clinic, I said, anger finally finding its way through the shock. He took his things and Rusty and just disappeared. Who does that, Susan? Who leaves their wife on the day of an embryo transfer? I'm so sorry, she replied, her voice strained with awkwardness. Kyle has been feeling trapped by the fertility treatments. He says you were so focused on having a baby that he what? I demanded when she trailed off. That he felt like just a donor. Not a husband anymore, she finished quietly. I'm not saying it's right, how he left. Richard and I told him he should talk to you face to face. Put him on the phone, I said. My grip tightening until my knuckles turned white. He doesn't want to talk right now, Natalie. He thinks it's better to communicate through lawyers. Lawyers, I repeated numbly. So this is really happening. I truly am sorry, Susan said, and I thought I detected genuine regret in her voice. For what it's worth, we always liked you. Past tense. They liked me. I was already being erased from their family narrative. After hanging up, I called the one person I knew would come without question. Megan had been my best friend since college. The one who'd stood beside me at my wedding, who'd held my hand through the first failed IVF cycles. Meg, I choked out when she answered. He's gone. Kyle left me. To her credit. Megan didn't waste time with questions. I'm coming over. Right now. Don't move. 45 minutes later, she used her emergency key to let herself in, gasping when she saw the state of the apartment. And probably the state of me, still in yesterday's clothes, hair matted from crying, eyes swollen nearly shut. Oh my God, she whispered, dropping her purse and rushing to the couch where I sat huddled under a throw blanket. What happened? I told her everything. The missed ride from the clinic, the emptied apartment, the text message, the conversation with Susan. Megan's expression shifted from shock to disbelief to fury as the story unfolded. That absolute bastard, she finally said, pulling me into a hug that unleashed a fresh wave of tears. Who leaves like that? Who does that to someone they supposedly loved? When I'd cried myself out again, Megan went into caretaker mode. She helped me to the bathroom, ran a warm shower, and laid out clean clothes. While I showered mechanically, she ordered food delivery and called my doctor's office to explain the situation and ask about the medical implications of stress after an embryo transfer. The nurse said you need to try to stay calm, Megan reported when I emerged. For the embryos. She said stress won't necessarily prevent implantation, but you need rest and to take your medications on schedule. The embryos. In the chaos of abandonment, I'd almost forgotten about the two potential lives that might be taking hold inside me at that very moment. The realization sent me into a fresh spiral of panic. What if they implant Meg? What if I get pregnant? I'll be doing this alone. He timed this perfectly, right when I can't even consider terminating because we tried so hard for these babies. Megan took my hands firmly in hers. First, let's see if you're pregnant. One crisis at a time. And second, you will never be alone. You have me, my parents who adore you, other friends. If those embryos stick, they will be the most loved babies on the planet, with or without Kyle. We spent that day in a strange limbo. Megan force-fed me soup and made me take my progesterone injections right on schedule. She called my boss at the architecture firm and arranged for emergency leave. She collected Kyle's wedding ring and key from the counter and put them in a drawer, out of sight. As evening fell again, the reality of my new normal began to settle in. This half-empty apartment. The ghost of Rusty's presence. The medical procedures continuing without my partner's support. The knowledge that while I'd been fighting for our future, Kyle had been dismantling our present. Megan stayed that night, sleeping beside me in the bed that suddenly felt enormous. Before we fell asleep, she asked the question I'd been avoiding all day. Do you want me to try to talk to him? Find out what happened? I stared at the ceiling, considering. Part of me desperately wanted answers, explanations, anything to make sense of this nightmare. But another part, a stronger part, recognized the deliberate cruelty in how Kyle had left. The careful planning. The calculated timing. No, I finally said. He chose to leave without facing me. He doesn't deserve to explain himself now. In the darkness, I placed my hand on my abdomen, where two embryos might be fighting to survive, unaware that their would-be father had already abandoned them. The thought that had been circling my mind all day finally crystallized into words. If these embryos implant, they'll never know their father. And if they don't, I went through all of this for nothing. Megan's hand found mine in the darkness. Not for nothing. Never for nothing. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if anything would ever feel worthwhile again. The days following Kyle's departure blurred together in a haze of grief and disbelief. Megan stayed with me for the first 3 nights before reluctantly returning to her own apartment and job, though she still came by every evening. My architecture firm was surprisingly understanding, granting me 4 weeks of medical and personal leave after Megan explained the situation to my supervisor. I existed in a strange limbo, mechanically following the post-transfer medical protocol while my personal life disintegrated around me. Each morning, I gave myself the prescribed progesterone injection, wincing as the needle pierced my already bruised skin. Each night, I swallowed pills that were supposed to support a pregnancy that I was no longer sure I wanted. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake in our bed, now just my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I'd missed. Had Kyle been unhappy all along? Was our entire marriage built on lies? The questions circled endlessly, with no answers forthcoming. Eating became an afterthought. Food tasted like nothing. And most days I had to set alarms on my phone to remind myself to force down something for nutrition. In just 2 weeks, my clothes hung loose on my frame, my face gaunt in the bathroom mirror. Despite my resolution not to contact Kyle, I found myself constantly checking his social media accounts. His Instagram, once filled with photos of us and Rusty, had been scrubbed clean of my existence. New pictures appeared, Kyle with friends at a baseball game, Kyle hiking with Rusty, Kyle smiling as though his life had improved dramatically without me. It was through these social media investigations that I discovered the first truly crushing piece of information. A mutual friend, Thomas, had posted a group photo at a restaurant downtown. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Kyle sitting close to a woman with long blonde hair, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. I zoomed in on the photo until the pixels blurred, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my phone. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 weeks before he left, while I was still giving myself daily hormone injections, while we were still theoretically trying to create a family together. The discovery sent me into a tailspin. I called Thomas, something I'd never normally do as he was more Kyle's friend than mine. "Hey, Natalie," he answered, surprise evident in his voice. "How are you holding up?" "Who is she?" I demanded, skipping pleasantries entirely. "The blonde woman with Kyle in your restaurant photo from last month." A long pause followed. "Listen, Natalie. I don't want to get in the middle of whatever's going on between you guys." He left me, Thomas. Emptied the apartment while I was at a fertility clinic and disappeared. I think I deserve to know if he was cheating. Another pause, then a sigh. Her name is Jessica. She works at his office. I don't know the details, but they've been friendly for a few months now. The confirmation was like a physical blow. Did everyone know? Was I the only one in the dark? No, not everyone, Thomas replied quickly. Look, Kyle only started hanging out with her more often recently. A lot of us thought they were just friends from work. But you suspected otherwise, I pressed. I had my concerns. He admitted reluctantly. Kyle changed over the past few months. Started going out more without you, being vague about his plans. I should have said something, and I'm sorry I didn't. After hanging up, I spent hours scrolling through Jessica's social media accounts, torturing myself with photos of the woman who had apparently been enough reason for Kyle to abandon our marriage and our fertility journey. She was younger than me, probably late 20s. No mention of fertility struggles on her perfect feed of yoga poses and beach days. The next devastating blow came exactly 2 weeks after Kyle's departure, when a courier arrived at my door with an envelope of legal documents. Divorce papers, already signed by Kyle, citing irreconcilable differences. A post-it note from his lawyer indicated where I should sign if I wanted an amicable and expedited process. I sat on the floor of the entryway, the papers scattered around me, laughing hysterically through tears. Amicable. As if there was anything amicable about abandoning your wife after a medical procedure, taking the dog she loved, emptying your shared home, and sending divorce papers by courier. The legal document laid out Kyle's proposed settlement. He would keep his retirement accounts and investments. I would keep mine. He wanted to sell the apartment and split the proceeds. He would take Rusty permanently. There was a section specifically addressing the embryo transfer, stating that if a pregnancy resulted, Kyle relinquished all parental rights and responsibilities. He had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. The calculated nature of it all made me physically ill. The final blow came the next day. I'd been spotting slightly, but had clung to the knowledge that some spotting can be normal in early pregnancy. But that morning, the spotting turned to definitive bleeding. I called the clinic, and they had me come in for a blood test, though we all knew what it meant. The nurse who had been with me through all 4 transfers was the one who called with the results. "I'm so sorry, Natalie. The HCG levels indicate the embryos didn't implant." I thanked her mechanically and hung up. Our last 2 embryos. Gone. 3 years of treatments, tens of thousands of dollars, countless injections and procedures, all ending in this moment. No baby. No husband. No dog. Just me in a half-empty apartment with divorce papers on the coffee table. That night, I hit rock bottom. I sat on the bathroom floor, surrounded by the remnants of my fertility medications, the Sharps container full of used needles, the empty hormone vials, the progesterone applicators I no longer needed. Physical evidence of the journey that had cost me everything and given nothing in return. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps Kyle had been right to leave. Maybe I had been obsessed with getting pregnant, reducing our relationship to a means to an end. Maybe I'd been so focused on the family we might have that I'd neglected the partnership we did have. But even as these thoughts tormented me, another voice fought back. He could have talked to me. He could have suggested therapy or taking a break from treatments. He could have done anything other than plan an elaborate disappearing act, starting a relationship with someone else while I was still fighting for our future. As I gathered the medical supplies to throw away, symbolically ending this chapter of my life, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, hollow-cheeked, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, hair unwashed and limp. "This can't be me," I whispered to my reflection. "I can't let this be me." But as I turned away from the mirror, I had no idea how to find myself again in the wreckage he'd left behind. 3 weeks after Kyle left, I was seriously considering giving up my life in Boston entirely. I'd researched breaking my lease, looked at job opportunities in my hometown of Portland, and started mentally cataloging which possessions I'd take and which I'd leave behind. Running away seemed like the only option left. I couldn't bear the thought of staying in this half-empty apartment, in this city full of memories, where I might run into Kyle and Jessica at any moment. I was packing a box of books when my phone rang with my boss's name on the screen. Julian had been understanding about my sudden leave of absence, but I'd been ignoring his check-in messages for the past week. This time, I reluctantly answered. "Natalie, thank you for picking up," he said, his voice careful. "How are you doing?" "I've been better," I replied flatly. "I'm actually thinking of relocating. I'll send in my official resignation next week." "Before you make any decisions," Julian said quickly, "I have a situation I'd like your input on. The Riverside Sustainable Housing Project is hitting some design challenges. The clients are pushing back on the latest revisions, and frankly, you're the only one who really understands their vision." "I'm sure Amanda can handle it," I said, naming one of my colleagues. "She's tried, but the clients are specifically asking for you. They trust your judgment." Julian paused. "Look, I'm not asking you to come back to the office. But would you be willing to review some plans from home? Just a consultation. The firm would compensate you for your time, of course." My first instinct was to refuse. I couldn't imagine focusing on work right now. But something about the familiarity of it, the thought of looking at blueprints, considering spatial relationships, solving practical problems, offered a tiny lifeline back to the person I used to be. Send over the files, I heard myself say. I'll take a look. The next morning, a courier delivered a large tube of blueprints along with a tablet loaded with the digital files. I spread the plans across my dining table, the first time I'd used it since Kyle left. For a few moments, I just stared at the blue lines, my mind blank. Then, almost involuntarily, I reached for a pencil and began making notes in the margins. Hours passed without my noticing. The familiar process of analyzing the designs, identifying problems, and sketching solutions absorbed me completely. For the first time in weeks, my mind wasn't consumed with thoughts of Kyle. The failed transfer or the divorce papers still sitting and signed on my coffee table. I was just an architect again, doing what I was trained to do. When I finally looked up, it was dark outside. I'd worked through the entire day without eating or even sitting down. My back ached from leaning over the table, but the pain felt different from the hollowness that had consumed me for weeks. This was productive pain earned through focus and effort. I emailed Julian my notes and suggested revisions that night. His response came within minutes. This is brilliant, Natalie. Exactly what we needed. The clients will be thrilled. The small spark of accomplishment was the first positive emotion I'd felt since opening our apartment door to emptiness. It wasn't happiness. Not even close, but it was something other than grief and rage. A reminder that parts of my identity existed independently from my marriage and my fertility struggles. The next day, Megan came by for her regular check-in, surprised to find me showered and dressed for the first time in weeks. You look better, she said cautiously as she unpacked the dinner she'd brought. I worked on a project yesterday, I told her. Just consulting from home, but it helped to use my brain for something other than obsessing over Kyle. Megan smiled. Genuine relief in her expression. That's great, not really great. As we ate, she hesitantly brought up something she'd been suggesting for weeks that I'd consistently refused. So, there's this support group that meets at the community center on Thursdays. It's for women dealing with fertility issues and pregnancy loss. I really think it might help to talk to people who understand that specific part of what you're going through. My instinct was to refuse again. The thought of sitting in a circle with strangers, sharing the most painful details of my life, made me want to retreat back to bed. But the small victory of yesterday's work had created a tiny opening in the wall I'd built around myself. Maybe, I said. I'll think about it. Megan, wise enough not to push, simply nodded and changed the subject. 2 days later, Julian called again with more questions about the Riverside project. This time, he asked if I'd be willing to join a video call with the clients to explain my revisions personally. The thought of having to present myself professionally, to engage with others on camera, was terrifying after weeks of isolation. But I agreed, spending the morning before the call washing my hair, putting on makeup, and finding a clean blouse that didn't hang off my now thinner frame. The call went surprisingly well. The clients were enthusiastic about my suggestions, and for 45 minutes, I was completely immersed in discussing sustainability features and community spaces. When we disconnected, I realized I'd gone almost an hour without thinking about Kyle or the divorce once. That night, I made a decision. I texted Megan, "What time is that support group tomorrow?" The community center was a modern building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and an airy atrium. I almost turned around 3 times on the walk from the parking garage to the meeting room. But Megan was waiting outside, and her encouraging smile propelled me through the door. The group was small, just 8 women sitting in comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The facilitator, Lisa, was a therapist specializing in fertility issues and had experienced multiple miscarriages herself. She welcomed me warmly, but without the pitying look I'd come to dread from friends and colleagues. For the first 20 minutes, I just listened as other women shared their stories. A woman named Daria described her 6th failed IVF cycle. Andrea talked about her surrogate miscarrying twins at 20 weeks. Jasmine explained how her husband had initially supported their fertility journey, but had recently started suggesting they accept their childless life. When it came my turn to speak, I intended to just give the basic facts and pass the conversation along. But once I started talking, the words poured out, the years of treatments, Kyle's abandonment, the failed final transfer, the divorce papers, the complete collapse of the future I'd planned. To my surprise, no one interrupted with platitudes or advice. They just listened, nodding in understanding, some wiping away tears that mirrored my own. When I finally fell silent, Lisa spoke. What you're experiencing is a compound grief. You're mourning multiple losses simultaneously: your marriage, your fertility journey, your vision of family, your trust. It's overwhelming because each loss alone would be significant, but together they've created a perfect storm. Daria reached over and squeezed my hand. My ex-husband left after our fourth failed cycle. Not quite as dramatically as yours, but he also claimed I was obsessed with getting pregnant. It took me a long time to realize that wasn't true. We were on this journey together until he decided to step off the path. Others shared similar experiences, partners who had initially committed to fertility treatments, but eventually buckled under the stress. Relationships that couldn't withstand the repeated disappointments, the feeling of being abandoned not just by a partner, but by one's own body. For the first time since Kyle left, I felt truly understood. These women knew exactly what it meant to build your life around a hoped-for child, to endure physical pain and emotional devastation in pursuit of that dream, to face both medical and relationship trauma simultaneously. As we were leaving, Andrea approached me. "The first meeting is the hardest," she said. "But it gets easier. And so does everything else. Eventually." I didn't fully believe her, but I thanked her anyway. On the drive home, Megan asked what I thought. "I'll go back next week," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. They get it. All of it. That night, I stood in the middle of my living room, looking at the spaces where Kyle's things had been. For weeks, I'd seen only absence, only what was missing. But now I noticed something different. Possibility. Empty spaces waiting to be filled with something new. I moved his wedding ring and key from the drawer where Megan had hidden them and placed them in an envelope. I addressed it to Kyle's parents' house, not needing these tangible reminders of betrayal in my space anymore. Then I opened my laptop and, instead of checking Kyle's social media as had become my obsessive habit, I pulled up the Riverside Project files again. I worked until well past midnight, not because I was trying to distract myself from pain, but because I was genuinely engaged with the challenge. As I finally went to bed, exhausted but with a clearer mind than I'd had in weeks, I realized I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to run away to Portland. I wasn't going to let Kyle's choices determine my future. I wasn't even going to sign the divorce papers yet, not until I'd consulted a lawyer of my own and ensured the settlement was truly fair. For the first time since opening that apartment door to emptiness, I felt a flicker of something that resembled strength. Not happiness, not even hope yet, but a quiet determination that had been buried beneath the shock and grief. I would rebuild, one day at a time. Starting now. 6 months after Kyle walked out, my life had taken on a new rhythm. I'd returned to work full-time, throwing myself into the Riverside Project with an intensity that impressed even Julian. The distraction of meaningful work became my lifeline. The hours spent solving design problems a respite from dwelling on the past. "We're nominating the Riverside Project for a Sustainability Award," Julian announced during a team meeting. "Natalie, the clients have specifically mentioned your contributions as critical to its success." Colleagues who had walked on eggshells around me for months now engaged normally again, including me in lunch plans and after-work drinks. I began accepting these invitations, rediscovering the simple pleasure of professional camaraderie. I also reached out to friends I'd neglected during the years of fertility treatments, people Kyle had subtly discouraged me from seeing regularly. Ashley, my college roommate who Kyle had always found too dramatic, became a regular visitor again. Daniel and Cassandra, a couple whose dinner invitations we'd repeatedly declined because Kyle found them boring, welcomed me back into their lives without resentment. "We missed you," Cassandra said simply when I apologized for the long absence. "We're just glad you're back now." With Megan's encouragement, I started seeing a therapist specializing in both divorce and fertility grief. Dr. Bennett helped me recognize patterns in my relationship with Kyle that I'd been blind to: his subtle control over my social circle, his dismissal of my career achievements, his habit of making me feel grateful for his participation in our fertility journey rather than seeing it as our shared responsibility. You mentioned that Kyle said you were obsessed with getting pregnant, Dr. Bennett noted during one session. But from what you've described, you both agreed to pursue fertility treatments. You both committed to multiple cycles. He was an active participant until he wasn't. These insights didn't erase the pain of abandonment, but they helped me see that the failure of our marriage wasn't solely my responsibility. Kyle had made choices, not just at the end, but throughout our relationship, that contributed to where we ended up. The fertility support group became a cornerstone of my week. I never missed a Thursday meeting, finding comfort in the shared understanding that existed in that room. Some weeks were harder than others. When Jasmine announced her successful donor egg pregnancy, I felt both genuine happiness for her and a renewed sense of my own loss. But the space allowed for all emotions, the complicated mix of joy and grief that defined all of our journeys. 3 months after Kyle left, I made the decision to move. The half-empty apartment held too many ghosts, too many spaces defined by absence. With the help of Ashley, who worked in real estate, I found a bright one-bedroom in a different neighborhood, closer to both my office and the waterfront where I'd always loved to walk. Moving day was both exhausting and cathartic. Megan, Ashley, Daniel, and Cassandra all showed up to help, turning the process into something almost festive with music and takeout pizza. As we arranged furniture in the new space, all mine, all reflecting my tastes alone, I felt a weight lifting. "This place is so you," Ashley remarked as she helped me hang a large abstract painting in the living room. "It's like this apartment was waiting for you to find it." The new apartment became my sanctuary. I painted the walls colors Kyle would have vetoed, bought furniture that prioritized beauty over practicality, and created a small home office where I could work on designs late into the night. For the first time in years, I was making choices based solely on my own preferences, without needing to compromise or justify. For months after the move, I faced one of the most difficult days of the rebuilding process: the divorce mediation. My lawyer, Sandra, a razor-sharp woman recommended by someone in my support group, had fought hard for a fair settlement, pushing back against Kyle's initial proposals that heavily favored his financial interests. The mediation was scheduled at a neutral law office downtown. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a tailored navy suit that projected confidence I didn't entirely feel. Megan drove me there, waiting in the car with a pint of ice cream and my favorite movie queued up on her tablet for afterward. Walking into the conference room and seeing Kyle for the first time in 5 months was jarring. He looked both familiar and like a stranger, dressed in a gray suit I didn't recognize, his hair cut shorter than he'd worn it during our marriage. Jessica wasn't with him, but her presence hovered between us nonetheless. "Natalie," he said with a nod, not quite meeting my eyes. "Kyle," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd feared it would be. The mediator, a former judge with decades of family court experience, kept the discussion focused on assets and practical matters. When Kyle's lawyer pushed for a quick sale of the apartment, Sandra produced documentation of the renovations I'd personally designed, increasing the property's value substantially. "My client has already relocated and relinquished her interest in the dog she co-owned with Mr. Harper," Sandra stated calmly. Given Mr. Harper's abrupt departure and the manner in which he removed his possessions without notice, we believe Ms. Stevens is entitled to a larger portion of the proceeds from the apartment sale to compensate for the emotional distress and practical difficulties this caused. I watched Kyle shift uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't the amicable and expedited process his post-it note had promised. This was me standing up for myself, refusing to be bulldozed by the man who had walked out while I was at a medical appointment. By the end of the 4-hour session, we had reached an agreement that felt, if not entirely fair, could anything truly compensate for what had happened, at least equitable. Kyle would keep Rusty, as I'd already accepted. The apartment would be sold, with the proceeds split 60-40 in my favor. Our retirement accounts would remain separate, and neither of us would pay alimony to the other. As we signed the final documents, Kyle finally spoke directly to me. "I'm sorry it ended this way." I looked at him, this man I'd once believed would be the father of my children, who I'd planned to grow old with. "No," I said quietly. "You're sorry it ended. You chose exactly how it ended." I walked out of that mediation room with my head high, feeling a curious mixture of grief and liberation. The legal severing of our ties was painful, but it also freed me from lingering in limbo. I was no longer Kyle's abandoned wife. I was just Natalie again, standing on my own. That weekend, I made another significant decision. For years, my vacation time had been dedicated to recovery from fertility procedures or visits to Kyle's family. Now, with 2 weeks of unused leave and the divorce settlement in progress, I booked a solo trip to New Mexico, a place I'd always wanted to visit for its distinctive architecture and landscapes. "I've never traveled alone," I admitted to Megan as I showed her the itinerary. "It's terrifying and exciting at the same time." "You're going to love it," she assured me. There's nothing like discovering you can navigate the world on your own terms. The trip was transformative. I hiked in the mornings, sketched buildings in the afternoons, and dined alone at restaurants without feeling self-conscious. I struck up conversations with strangers, took a pottery class on a whim, and spent a day driving with no destination in mind, stopping whenever something caught my eye. In Santa Fe, I visited a small gallery and found myself transfixed by a painting of a single tree standing on an otherwise empty plain, its branches reaching toward a vast sky. Something about its solitary strength resonated deeply. I bought it without hesitation, my first significant purchase that was entirely for myself, not part of a shared home or future. When I returned to Boston, I hung the painting in my bedroom where I would see it first thing every morning. It became a symbol of this new chapter. Standing alone didn't have to mean loneliness. It could mean freedom, strength, and possibilities I had yet to discover. As the 6-month mark of Kyle's departure approached, I realized something surprising. The acute pain had dulled to a background ache that surfaced occasionally but no longer dominated my days. I could go hours, sometimes entire days, without thinking about him. The future I'd lost had been replaced not with a new vision exactly, but with an openness to whatever might come next. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Julian stopped me. "A friend of mine is opening a restaurant next weekend. They're having a small launch party. Would you be interested in coming?" For a moment, I hesitated, old insecurities surfacing. But the woman who had traveled solo through New Mexico, who had stood her ground in divorce mediation, who had built a new home for herself, answered without overthinking. "I'd like that," I said. "Thank you for the invitation." It wasn't a date, just a casual social invitation. But as I walked home in the crisp autumn air, I realized it represented something significant. I was open to new experiences again, to meeting new people, to possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. The half-empty apartment that had once symbolized everything I'd lost had led me here, to a life that was fully mine, furnished with my choices, populated by people who truly saw me, and open to a future I was finally ready to explore. Exactly 1 year after I dragged my aching body up those 5 flights of stairs to discover my life shattered, I woke up in my sunlit bedroom to the sound of birds outside my window. The painting of the solitary tree caught the morning light, its colors vivid against the soft blue wall I'd chosen for my sanctuary. So much had changed in 365 days. Externally, I barely resembled the woman who had collapsed sobbing on that half-empty apartment floor. My hair, once long because Kyle preferred it that way, now fell in a stylish bob that framed my face. I'd regained the weight I'd lost in those dark months after he left, my body strong from the hiking group I'd joined in the spring. My professional life had flourished beyond what I could have imagined during those weeks I considered abandoning my career and fleeing to Portland. The Riverside Project had indeed won that sustainability award, bringing positive attention to our firm and resulting in a promotion for me. I now led my own small team, mentoring younger architects and having direct input on which projects the firm pursued. The apartment I'd once shared with Kyle had sold for well above asking price, the proceeds allowing me to make a down payment on a small townhouse in a neighborhood I'd always loved, but Kyle had dismissed as trying too hard to be trendy. The irony wasn't lost on me. My new home reflected only my tastes: bold colors, natural materials, spaces designed for both solitude and gathering friends. No compromises, no vetoed choices. The bookshelves held volumes Kyle had considered pretentious. The kitchen contained appliances he would have deemed unnecessary. The guest room doubled as a home studio where I could work on personal design projects. But the external changes paled in comparison to the internal transformation. Dr. Bennett had helped me recognize that what I'd initially seen as catastrophic abandonment had ultimately freed me from a relationship that had been subtly diminishing me for years. Kyle's controlling tendencies, his dismissal of my passions, his way of making me feel grateful for basic partnership, all patterns I'd been blind to while focused on our shared goal of starting a family. The fertility struggles didn't create problems in your marriage, Dr. Bennett had observed during one of our sessions. They just magnified what was already there. The Thursday support group remained a cornerstone of my week, though my role had evolved. Newer members now looked to me as someone who had weathered the storm of combined fertility grief and relationship loss. I found myself offering the same quiet understanding others had once offered me. Andrea, who had become a close friend, nicknamed me the Phoenix after I shared a particularly difficult memory and followed it with insights about how I'd used that pain to rebuild myself stronger. "You literally rose from the ashes of your old life," she said, squeezing my hand. "It's inspiring to watch." Dating had re-entered my life, cautiously at first. Julian's restaurant invitation had indeed been just friendly, but it reintroduced me to social settings where meeting new people was possible. 3 months ago, I'd met Patrick, an urban planner whose work often intersected with architectural projects. Our relationship was still new, proceeding at a deliberate pace we both appreciated after previous heartbreaks. "I like that we're both taking this slowly," Patrick had said on our 5th date. "There's something valuable about really seeing each other before rushing into anything." His words had resonated deeply. With Kyle, everything had moved quickly, from dating to marriage to trying for a baby. This time, I was learning the pleasure of gradually discovering another person, without expectations or predetermined timelines. I hadn't abandoned the dream of motherhood entirely, but it had transformed. I'd begun researching options for single parenting, sperm donors, adoption possibilities, even embryo adoption using the remaining embryos of couples who had completed their families through IVF. But I was giving myself permission to explore these options thoughtfully, without the desperation that had characterized my final years with Kyle. "The timeline is yours now, Dr. Bennett had reminded me. "There's no negotiating, no compromising. You get to decide if and when and how." That freedom, to shape my own future without accommodation or apology, had become precious to me. Perhaps the most unexpected development had been my involvement in a mentorship program for women navigating divorce and fertility challenges simultaneously. What had begun as casual coffee meetings with 2 women from my support group had evolved into a structured program recognized by several local hospitals and fertility clinics. "Your perspective is invaluable, Lisa," the support group facilitator had told me when she began referring newly divorced fertility patients to me. "You've been where they are. And you've not just survived it, you've transformed through it." I'd created a resource guide, compiling the practical information I'd wished for during those early days: recommendations for divorce attorneys familiar with fertility issues, therapists specializing in reproductive grief, financial advisors who understood the complexities of dividing assets that included stored embryos or sperm. On this anniversary morning, I had plans to meet with a woman named Sophie, recently left by her husband after their 2nd miscarriage. We'd connect at a quiet cafe where I'd listen to her story, share relevant parts of mine, and remind her that the current pain, while overwhelming, would not define her forever. As I dressed for the day, I glimpsed myself in the full-length mirror, not scrutinizing for flaws as I once would have, but taking in the whole person reflected back at me. Strong, present, completely herself. The final piece of closure had come unexpectedly 3 weeks earlier. I'd been grocery shopping when I turned a corner and nearly collided with a shopping cart pushed by none other than Kyle. Beside him stood a blonde woman I recognized from social media as Jessica, and between them, a cart filled with weekend groceries and a bottle of champagne. For a moment, we all froze, the awkwardness palpable. Kyle looked simultaneously guilty and defensive, while Jessica shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Natalie," Kyle finally said. "How are you?" A year ago, this encounter would have devastated me. 6 months ago, it would have filled me with rage or bitter words. But standing there in the produce section, I felt something entirely unexpected. Nothing. No anger, no hurt, no longing. Just the mild discomfort of running into someone from your past. "I'm doing well," I replied truthfully. "Better than well, actually." Kyle nodded, seeming unsure how to respond to my evident well-being. "That's good to hear. You look great." "Thank you," I said, then nodded politely to Jessica before continuing on my way, leaving them standing bewildered in my wake. As I finished my grocery shopping, I realized that encounter had given me something invaluable, confirmation that I was truly free. Not just legally divorced, not just physically separated, but emotionally liberated from the power Kyle had once held over my happiness. Now, on this significant anniversary, I opened my journal and wrote a letter to my past self, the woman who had collapsed on that kitchen floor, believing her life was over. I wrote about the strength she didn't yet know she possessed, the community she would find, the career that would flourish, the new home she would create, the sense of self that would emerge from the wreckage. When I finished writing, I closed the journal and picked up my phone to check the time. I had an hour before meeting Sophie. Enough time for a walk along the harbor, my morning ritual in this new life. Outside, the October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and possibility. As I walked the familiar path, I reflected on how thoroughly my definition of family had transformed. My circle now included friends who had seen me at my worst and still showed up, colleagues who respected my vision, new connections that enriched my days, and most importantly, a relationship with myself built on genuine understanding and compassion. What Kyle had taken from me in leaving so cruelly, the dream of a traditional family, the safety of a long marriage, the comfort of planning a future with a partner, had been replaced by something I never could have anticipated, a life entirely my own, shaped by conscious choices rather than compromise or obligation. The pain hadn't disappeared completely. There were still moments when grief would surface unexpectedly, passing a playground filled with children, hearing a friend announce a pregnancy, seeing a golden retriever that reminded me of Rusty. But these moments no longer derailed me. They were simply part of my story, threads in the tapestry of a life that contained both loss and renewal. As I reached my favorite bench overlooking the harbor, I sat for a moment, watching sailboats navigate the morning breeze. 1 year ago today, I'd believed my life was ending. Instead, it had been beginning in ways I couldn't have imagined through the tears. I took a deep breath of the salt air and smiled. The woman who would walk into that cafe to meet Sophie was not the same one who had climbed those 5 flights of stairs a year ago. She was stronger, wiser, more compassionate toward herself and others. She had learned that some endings, however painful, make space for new beginnings that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Have you ever experienced a devastating loss that eventually led to unexpected growth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you're currently in the middle of your own storm, please know that healing isn't linear, but it is possible. Like, subscribe, and share this video if it resonated with you. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories of resilience and transformation. Thank you for being part of this journey with me, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful rebuilding happens after the most complete devastation.